Hello, my name is Darrell Robert Schoon, and as I said in my last program, I'm going to take this discussion in a slightly different direction, in a radically different direction. The past few years I've talked mainly about money, and I've exhausted the subject, at least as much as I know about it. And I hopefully that over the past few years I've explained money, its nature, in a way that sort of explains what's going on around you. And this spring I was invited to speak at a seminar called the Liberty Mastermind Symposium. And the idea of liberty and freedom was a very big part of that gathering. And it caused me to think that this is an area in which I want to go to. Because it's not what it appears to be. Like money is not what it appears to be. It started out as a form of savings and has now become an instrument of debt. And people who are involved in it, you and I, we have no idea what's going on. Well, this other area of freedom, and the program is called, basically, this area is called, I title it Freedom and the Matrix. And in the last program, I touched upon the Matrix and what it is. But in truth, the title Freedom in the Matrix is explained by two subtitles. There's the title Freedom and the Matrix. There's two subtitles here that I hope you will come to understand. Freedom in the Matrix and freedom from the Matrix. And what I did is to start off the discussion, I used these discs, CDs. And my metaphor was, when we're born, we have a blank CD. It is called our memory. And from the moment of our birth, that CD becomes filled. It becomes filled with, first of all, impressions. All right? And those impressions begin to fill up gradually, so you begin to get a context of other impressions that are coming in. The baby, the child, understands mother, father, hunger. All sorts of emotions come in. And the interesting thing about it is that every other baby has one of these too. Every other person on the face of this earth is also born with a blank disc, upon which they are filled their impressions, their judgments, their beliefs. And I pointed out that what happens is, what starts out as a process of curiosity, openness, just filling it up, filling it up, filling it up, begins to change. Why? Because certain things become embedded in that memory, in that sense of self. One of the first things that becomes embedded is the experience that you have no power. In a world where there seems to, whoever has power has it over you. It's clearly, this is a nurse, it's a doctor, it's the father, the mother, anybody else. You are an infant lying there, crying, trying to make your needs known. You have no control over your body, its functions, or you're becoming hungry. All you're able to do is voice or attempt to communicate these things in such a way that other people out there will respond to your needs in such a way that they will be met. Hopefully, when you begin to cry, they will understand this, that you're hungry. Your mother will pick you up, nurse you, or whatever. Your diapers are wet, you've soiled them. You cry, same cry you made as when you're hungry, and maybe somebody will go, oh, he's hungry, and somebody else will go, no, we got to change his diapers. All right, you do it. All right? So this is what builds up. But the embedding of those impressions is on each one of these discs, on yours, your parents before you, your children that will follow you, is that you are helpless in a world in which you have very little control, and that your wherewithal in this world, the ability to get your needs met, is a direct function of the control you have in that world. And along with this, a sense of self develops, who you are. All right? Your mind tells you, your disc tells you, you're not your mother, you're not your father, you're not the world. Whatever you are, you're something separate and distinct from that which you are in. So this gets embedded in the disc along with it. And along as those thoughts come in, as experience comes in, a sense of self develops. A sense that will change throughout your life. A sense that will change from moment to moment as you become serially sad, angry, happy, frustrated, whatever. That sense of self, however, that develops from a very early age, the older you get, you begin to identify with it. All right? If you were born into a Jewish family, and I've said this before because it's a great metaphor, in Israel, your sense is that you are Jewish, whatever that means. And you may not understand it, but you know that you are Jewish from a very early age because you are told you are. Whereupon a few miles away, a child born on the West Bank, a Palestinian child, is very clear that there are Jews, and they are not one of them, and that they are an Arab, a Muslim, perhaps a Shiite, perhaps a Shia, or whatever those break down into, and their disc tells them, and their identity is very, very different also. But what these discs have in common, the Jewish child, the Palestinian child, the Buddhist child, the child born in an atheist family, is this, that whoever they are, they have come into a world where they lack power, and they need to make them to communicate their needs known, and the more power they have, the greater the chances of having those needs met. So, what you have then is an aggregate. We are on a planet with an aggregate of, here they are, more of these. All right? I mean, if you sat there and perhaps said, this is the Earth, this would be so high as to fill itself up with 2-3 billion of them. I don't know how many of us here. But I do know that no matter what the number is, each of those on this planet has a disk that is telling it who it is with all the memory of its experiences, and that not only is that who you are, but that you are alone and you lack power. What this does, it drives at a very early age the attempt to get whatever power there is. It can come, some identify it with yelling, screaming. Others are quiet, and they get their needs met by being soft. People want to take care of you because you're nice. The other one, maybe your brother or sister, gets what he or she wants by yelling and screaming. Now, that takes us to another issue, personality. But this is an issue that you will not know until you are probably well into your 8, 7, 8, and people are telling you this. But by the time you get into your teens, this issue of personality begins to form the way you operate in the world. You begin to notice what your personality is. You begin to notice there are things that you gravitate towards and things you avoid. You begin to notice whether you are secure in groups of people or insecure. You begin to notice, and others tell you and reinforce what you've noticed of whether you are smart, slow, quick, good-looking, unattractive, acceptable, unacceptable, litanies and litanies of judgments that go and fill up your disc, your understanding of who you are. And all this is happening unconsciously. All this is happening at warp speed as you are moving through this experience that we call life. Now, something happens in your teenage years, whether or not you're a Jewish kid in Israel, a Muslim kid in the West Bank, a Buddhist, a Hindu, or an atheist, in North America, South America, whether you're indigenous or whether your father is a high-tech multimillionaire in the Silicon Valley. Puberty. Puberty is the term that we've given to the expression, to the experience of what we call gender. All right? Now, we have gone, and when I started this discussion today, I talked about that disk. There are billions of this planet with the very same disk, well, with very different information on it. And as I said before in previous programs, each one of us believes that our disk is the world, and it represents the world to us, and so it does. If you've grown up at a time when you were told the world was flat, your baseline is the world is flat. If you were born at a time where you were told the world is spherical and round, your baseline for your geophysical perception of yourself and your planet is that it's round. Or as Terry Pratchett said, if you were born at a time when you really found out that we lived on this oval reality on the back of a turtle, that forms the basis of your reality and your discussion with other people. All right? So what is so is determined, in fact, by ignorant, maybe that was a Freudian slip, but by circumstance and culture of which you find yourself in. All right? So we've moved from this thing of which everybody has a separate disk with all their memories, all their built-ins, moved into through a sense of personality that you find out because you're dialed to zero. And if you are sort of a curious, acquisitive kid, you think everybody is that way. And when you run into another child that's withdrawn and fearful, you go, what's wrong with this kid? But I want to tell you, that kid whose personality is somewhat withdrawn and fearful, they look at you and go, where did this guy come from? I mean, he's probably a bully. In fact, you may become a bully with this other kid because he's giving away ground without you having to do anything. Now, what does that do to you, who is active, forceful, upfront? In your disk, it says you can get what you want from this kid without doing anything. You might find yourself at school, sitting next to the kid. He comes in. You like his potato chips. Your mother didn't give you a potato chip in your lunch bag. And you look at him and you go, hey, give me those potato chips. And that kid sits there and he hands them to you. What does that do? It reinforces your sense of power and control, which is what you are looking for. Well, what does that do to that kid? It reinforces his sense of lack of power and the need for control. And thus we play these roles with each other. So we've gone with everybody with a disk. We've moved it up to the level where we have different personalities with all the variances in between. And we know them. All right? But whatever they are, everyone has a distinct one that they know that they themselves have. All right? And they see the world and each other from the reference point of that specific personality and that specific disk. Which brings us to puberty. I assume that most of people who I've talked to have gone through this extraordinary experience. All right? And that it is as discombobulating as anything. Already, your disk is in a state of flux. You are scrambling to maintain a sense of control in this reality that is beyond your ability to control. And I don't care if you're the bully, and I don't care if you're the victim. Each of those knows that that greater reality in which they have found themselves is beyond their ability to control. No matter how much they're driven to get as much power as they can. You can never get enough because it's always beyond your control. And along comes puberty. The last thing you would need. Wow. It comes coursing in invisibly to each of us. To the vast majority of us, it's a polarizing experience. And you find it out in a social situation. You're a boy. They're girls. Who are they? They're very different than you. But there's an attraction. And for a percentage, much smaller percentage, you're a boy. There's a girl. Who are they? What are they about? and there's other boys, and you're attracted to them. And you have no idea why. And neither does the boy who's attracted to the girls have any idea of why he is attracted to them and not to boys. But when we were growing up, it was verboten to speak of attractions between the same gender. But being verboten did not mean it didn't happen. It just meant when it made itself obvious and out expressed later, there were a lot of judgments about it. And so it has been. And so it is changing. That disc is changing in regards to gender. But there's another thing about this disc that I want to tell you about, and that's the resistance to change. Why is that disc resistant to change? Because the sense of self is so fragile and so transitory and made up from moment to moment. It is trying to get control in a world and a reality of which it lacks control. So the sense of self, it holds on to its beliefs, its judgments, its point of view, its friends, in such a way to give it a sense of stability. And the issue of gender is central to that disc, to your sense of identity, and to your attempt to control what cannot be controlled. As opposed to the disc, of which there are billions on this planet at any one time, and more now than at any time in our history, as opposed to the sense of personality, of which there may be the same number of personalities, maybe more variants, but the same types. All right? I remember when I was going to college and we had, man, this is the dark ages of science. And we read about mesomorphs, all right? And which are, endomorphs, which is basically fat people, skinny people, fat, skinny people, skinny, fat people. That's where the study of psychology had gotten to when I went to the University of California. All right? And that's why when a few years later, some guy who had also gone to the University of California and had been a TA at Berkeley, I meet him in the Haight-Ashbury, and he wants to do my chart. I don't believe this stuff. I'm in the Haight-Ashbury. These are the hippies. This is the hippie stuff. And so I agree to have it done. And he does my chart, and he explains me in a way that's stunning. How can this be? My disc said the ability to take a person's point in time and space at which their first breath was drawn, make a map of the heavens, and from those angles and where the planetary bodies are on that map, deduce from that map a person's life, personality, foibles, strengths, and trials is basically impossible. And so it was on my disc until it was done. When my disc absorbed something that it could not otherwise accept or understand, it started breaking apart. It was shattered in a fundamental way because something had been introduced on that disc at odds with everything on that disc before it. Everybody's disc is resistant to change. Why? Because we're trying to hold that world of fragmented pieces, of chaos, of constant change together in such a way that we can live with the chaos and uncertainty and attendant fear. Everybody out there walking around with a disc, the last thing you're going to see of them is fear. In fact, the most fearful are going to appear aggressive because their disc is so fragmented, so resistant to change, that they're going to confront change with aggression. They're going to be active about it. If you find yourself next to this kind of a person at a party and bring up something at variance with their disc, they're liable to go off on you. Why? Because their disc, they can't take that kind of change, and they're trying to protect it. Now, we may whatever, call this person whatever we're going to call you, but I want to assure you that person's behavior is yours, except in a more extreme situation, because they are under more duress than you are. Or perhaps your personality is able to handle change in ways their personality is not built to handle change. But it's only the variance of degree, not in kind. Now into this sense of self is imposed gender. And whereas we have billions of discs, a multiplicity of personalities, there's only basically two genders. No, there's more than two genders. But there's basically two poles. One we call male, the other we call female. All right? Now, this is where I move into metaphysics. Because the explanation of gender is basically found in metaphysics. Bucky Fuller said there are two worlds that we live in. One is a physical, and the other is a metaphysical. Most of you are familiar only with the physical. My explanation of money was purely physical. There's a word for it. It's called exoteric. That which is outside, the outpicturing. Everything I explained to you about central bank, everything I explained to you about the appearance of paper money in Szechuan in the year 1224, everything I explained to you about how England was able to parlay debt-based money into world dominion, that's exoteric. But the reasons of why England assumed that role, other than the exoteric reasons, are esoteric. The reasons of why you were here at this time are esoteric, not exoteric. It is exoteric that you're here. If we were to understand the reasons why you're here, that is esoteric. And if I'm to take this into another area to explain gender, we have to go to the esoteric. We have to go to the metaphysical. Now, this explains how this disc came into being. The metaphysical, the esoteric, explains what you are doing here. It explains the context of this disc. You have a disc, and you may not even have known it until you started watching this. You call it your memory, but you assumed a lot of things about it that were just assumptions that you really basically didn't know. This is our ground zero. We start from there, the basis. This is where it gets really interesting. This is the study of metaphysics, which basically is the explanation of the esoteric, the basic explanation of the physical, of which there are no other explanations other than the esoteric and the metaphysical. And this is something that if your world only exists of data from the physical world, you have no idea about. And because you have no idea about, your mind is going to reject everything I say. Why? That's how the mind operates. The mind is engaged 24/7 trying to stay stable in an unstable world. The mind is engaged 24/7 trying to achieve power in a world in which it finds itself powerless. The identity is engaged 24/7 in this futile pursuit. And it can't do anything about it. But to understand why, that's when we have to go to the metaphysical, to the esoteric. And so, in our next program, that's where we're going to go. And until then, take care of that disc. But don't give it any more power than it already has. And I'm going to continue on the subject of freedom and the matrix. And as I said on the previous program, there really are two subtitles to this, freedom in the matrix. There is freedom in the matrix and freedom from the matrix. In that previous program, I recapitulated the idea of discs. Each of us has our own memory. our own experiences that individualize ourselves, makes us different than those next to us, than those who gave us birth and those who are born to us. And I went and I talked about how one of the primary things on everybody's disc is they are born helpless in a world of which they have very little control. And embedded in everybody's disc is the belief, whether spoken or unspoken, whether known or unknown, whether acknowledged or unacknowledged, is that if I had but enough power, I could get the world the way I wanted it and have my needs met in the way I want to. We have billions of our fellow disc holders in this planet with the same imprint. And we have the same imprint about the need for power, as each of us has different imprints about life itself, breaking us down into cultures, races, nationalities, ideologies, beliefs of competing for enough power to have the world be the way we want it to be for us. If that's all there was, we are headed for certain destruction. It would only be a matter of time until the aggregate collective consciousness would achieve enough power to overrun everybody else on the planet, or to run into another aggregate of power strong enough to go into a battle so deep, so consequential, it would destroy the planet itself and everybody's disk. This is where we are headed in the 20th century. For the first time, man achieved such technological ability that he could kill far more than one person with a thrust of a sword. By pushing a button, millions could be annihilated. And during the 20th century, it is estimated that this is what happened to 170 million human beings on the planet. 170 million discs wiped out because of the need and the desire to impose one's ideology, one's control over another. Driven by the need, by the belief that unless you have enough power, you are not going to get what you want. This was the story of the 20th century. And indeed, if that was the limit of the story, the 21st would be the annihilation. It almost happened in the 20th, and what wasn't achieved in the 20th would happen inevitably in the 21st. But I wanted to explain, and this is where I left you at the last, after we moved through the idea of the disc, we moved into the idea of everybody having different personalities. And what I didn't touch on was, in those collective personalities, not only in the collective sense of the personality, we had aggregates of discs that shared certain collective social personalities. Just as much as individuals shared an individual personality, countries exhibited their own collective personality. This is perhaps easiest seen in Europe, where we have these aggregates of collective personalities so close and yet so different. In the middle of Europe, we have the German personality. People make fun of them. They say they have no sense of humor. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. That's a judgment of the disc. That's an observation of the disc. Whether they do or not, it's problematical. But this Germanic consciousness, collective consciousness, produced some of the greatest music and philosophy and thought that existed on this planet. Bach, Beethoven, all right? Rudolf Steiner, brilliant thinkers. And yet this was the same culture that in 1940 attempted to destroy Western civilization as we know it, so it could get the power that it felt it needed in order to survive. Never before had technology been aggregated and ovens built to incinerate the millions that were to die in their death camps. And across the planet, another culture, like the Germans, polite, humble. The Japanese embarked on their own path of destruction, attempting to do in Asia what Germany was attempting to do in the West, laying low China, South Korea, Vietnam, torturing brutally whoever was in its path. And these are the same people in another time, in another context, that are so gracious and so appropriate and so law-abiding. You would wonder, how can this be? Well, it is because of the need to power. When any culture feels itself either threatened or perhaps given the opportunity to assume power over others, it will do so. When any individual either feels so threatened or given an opportunity to get power over another, will do so. In the last part of that program, I went in the area, I moved from just these discs, these millions of discs, billions of discs, to personalities. You can take this further. I mean, you have the equivalents of the Germans and the Japanese, the French and the Chinese. They both love to eat. They both have sort of their music is sort of the same. It's impressionistic in its way. Eric Satie, Chinese music. All right. You had Italy in the West and the Philippines in the East. Italy, home of the Catholic Church, holder of guilt for the Western world. Philippines, only country to go Catholic. Men like this. The women hot, passionate. All right? The Eastern equivalent of the Italians. So we have the East and the West. And that leads us to where I left the last program off about gender. And I left that discussion with the idea of gender, which we know as sexuality, which we know really as polarities, the male and the feminine polarities. And we've grown adult enough to know in 2014 that these aren't hard and fast. All right? That gender is not necessarily correlable to exterior plumbing. A certain percentage of each, where you would expect them to be attracted to the opposite or not. And this attraction is embedded and as unconscious as it is for those in the majority. Now, because those in the majority don't understand it, because that's what the disc does, the disc strikes out at everything different. The disc blames everything different for the problems that it has. The German disc blamed the Jews for the problems that the Germans found themselves in 1930. The Jews blamed the Palestinians and the Arabs for the problems that they encounter in 2010 and 14. And in America, we blame the Mexicans. It's just the disc and how that disc operates. And were it not for the metaphysics of the situation, were it not for the invisible, we would be well on our way, and we have been for much of our history, to destroying ourselves in the search for more power, control over others, control over an experience over which we have no control and intuitively know it, whether we want to face it or not. This is metaphysics. This metaphysics context contains all the discs. Now, those with discs don't see this cover. They don't see its protection. They don't see its purpose. Why? We are absorbed by the experience of our disc. We are dazzled. We are driven to solve the problems that the disc appears to present to us in hoping to extricate ourselves from the problems on that disc. One of which is freedom and liberty. But as I will show you later, it is not as easy as it appears, because it is not freedom per se. It is in the context of that disc and indeed of the metaphysical reality from which the disc is derived. And so it was in the last program I touched upon the metaphysics, and I explained that the metaphysical is the invisible, which the disc cannot see, touch, feel, so it disregards it. The disc is based upon physical experience and memory. And so it is a prisoner. You become a prisoner to your disc. In that same way, I am as much a prisoner on my disc when the Golden State Warriors find themselves in the NBA playoffs. Why? Because I lived in San Francisco for much of my life. I watched these people lose year after year. They had players like Rick Barry. I mean, the DMs, the runners. I mean, it was wonderful watching them. And they would lose and lose and lose. And so now that they've made it to the NBA playoffs, I watch them with an intent and a desire reflective of my personal disc. Why do I follow the Arizona Wildcats? Because I live in Tucson. And my mother went to the University of Arizona. When I was growing up, I used to follow the USC Trojans. Why? Because my father went and graduated from USC. So is the identification that happens on your disc that causes you to focus your energy, focus your attention with that ephemeral sense that you believe is you. I want to assure you, you're far more than the aggregate memories on your disc, even though you have no idea of what it is and have no idea that that disc even exists. And here we go into the metaphysics of the disc. This, which contains all the discs are contained within this, is the metaphysics, which is the background on which our individual dramas and collective dramas play out. Now the transition from the disc to the metaphysical is gender. It's not your individual disc. It's not your personality. The closest link you have to that is gender, which is not gender per se, it's polarity. The negative, the positive. It's what the Chinese refer to as the yin and yang. And their Western equivalents, the French, had it down to the le and the la. There is a basic differentiation. Why? Because the disc and the manifest reality in which it finds itself is a very function of the polarity of the yin and the yang, the male and the female, and the positive and negative. In its unified state, there is no manifest creation. In its unified oneness, there is only the void from which we have come, of which we are a part of. But once in the manifest reality, all we know is the manifest created world of the disc. Our separateness, our lack of power, and the belief that we need more to get what we want in life to be happy. and were it that way, we would be in trouble. And for most of our history, all of our recorded history, we have been in trouble. But we are here at an extraordinary time. An extraordinary time. My thoughts about money coincide with this because our world at this time is formed by money, which is scarcity, made up of pieces of paper, the belief attendant upon it that if we had enough of that paper, we would be happy. Donald Sterling, you know how much paper that guy's got? You know how unhappy he is? He's not the first example. But what are you to do? Give it up for nothing? To take a vow of poverty? I'll assure you, being poor is not going to get you closer to the truth than wealthy. It may get you closer if you're less attached. But by the same token, you could be as rich as Croesus and not attached. And you would be as high as any mystic on the planet. You could be the Buddha, the Christ. But that depends on your relationship to the metaphysical, to the source of all this is. When that source, when the undefined, when the unmanifested, which gave rise to the disk and to you, whether you believe in the unmanifested, whether you believe in a source, whether you self-identify as a fundamentalist Christian, a Unitarian, a New Ager, a Buddhist, it doesn't matter. That's where it comes from. The polarity of the one in the two creates the manifested universe of which your disk and you are a part, whether you know it or not. Now, gender, polarity. Our world itself is a reflection of this polarity. What we call the East, the inward, the contemplative, is very different than what we call the West, outward, pushing, gaining, acquisitive. And for the first time in history, the East and the West have come together. And I want to assure you, it's not by accident. Where we are today is not a function of your disk individually, the aggregate number of disks in nations. No. Where we are today is a function of the metaphysics of it all. It is moving towards oneness. It is moving to rebalance the yin and the yang that have been unbalanced ever since the original manifestation into creation that science calls, in the abeyance of anything else, the Big Bang. I want to say something about that Big Bang. I want to explain something about that expression into manifestation, into the male and the female, into the negative, the positive, into thought and reason, into the geopolitical East, the geopolitical West. When that happened, when the one became manifest, polarizing into the two polarities that needed to be manifest for a manifest creation, something happened. It was chaotic. It set in motion feelings that are there today. In the male polarity, when it burst into this reality, it found itself in a physical creation for the first time, out of the oneness of non-separation, of pure love, of equanimity, of pure peace. And it found itself, what it felt was trapped in a something it knew nothing thereof. So the male polarity, its feeling was of being trapped. And the feminine polarity, ripped away from the male polarity, it felt abandoned. It felt separate. And these are the dynamics that are still driving us today. But these are the dynamics that the metaphysical whole is now moving to heal. In that dynamic, in a very rough way, because gender here is no more fixed than homosexuality, heterosexuality, and the variances that we have. But there is a line on which these can be done. And the expression of that insecurity is felt when these two discs come together in a relationship. Now, I know you've seen magnets, all right? And you know how they pull together? Until they get real close and you can't push them anymore. There's a resistance that happens the closer they get. Well, they're not supposed to be so close, they go back to one. As Bucky said, they're supposed to be in relationship to each other. They're supposed to circle each other, each retaining and maintaining their own integrity, their own polarity. But I want to tell you what happened. When the one became manifest, when the creation was existed, it was such a shock. It was such a shock that each disc felt it needed power. And which was the disc that got it of the two polarities? It was the active male polarity that made a grab for power, because it felt only if it had enough power that it would return to the stability, love, and peace and equanimity that it knew before and knew only that it didn't have. And what did this power come at the expense of? The other disc. The feminine. The feminine. And that is the way it's been, to use that trite phrase, since time immemorial. That is the way it has been in ancient times. That is the way it is now. And that would be the way it would be forever if time were merely to continue on its continuum into the indefinite future. But it's not. Something is afoot. The metaphysical. The wholeness that has remained unchanged, even with the expression of the imbalanced physical universe, is always balanced. And it is moving now to rebalance your disc, my disc, America's disc, China's disc, Israel's disc, the Gaza Strip's disc,